Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to your lecture sessions for this week for anatomy and physiology. So the system we're covering this week is the cardiovascular system. Before we go into the lecture itself, I just want to remind you that the quiz, your assessment quiz for the cells is available for you to do this week. So it opens at 9 AM on Monday the 6th of September and will close at 9 AM Monday the 13th of September. So you have an entire week to do that. It will look very similar to the last one you did on the musculoskeletal system, except this time with information on the cells. So you'll have the diagram to drag and drop the right information into, as well as selecting the right statements that apply to that particular system. So jump in there and do that while it's still fresh in your mind, and let's move on with this week's lecture. So we're going to talk first about the cardiovascular system, and we're going to talk about a few conditions, and then move on to the respiratory system a little bit later on. So let's get stuck in. Learning objectives for this first lecture: name and describe the anatomy or the parts of the cardiovascular system. And the second one is to describe the physiology or the functions of those parts of the cardiovascular system. Okay, so we're going to move on to look at the anatomy first. Three different parts of the cardiovascular system. The first one is the heart itself, okay, or the pump. The second one is the blood vessels or the pipes that transport the blood around the body. And the third part of the cardiovascular system is the blood. Okay, so essentially you just need to know those are the three main parts. We're going to learn a little bit more about each of those three parts as we work through the lecture today. Yeah, so heart, blood vessels and the blood, the pump, the pipes, and the medium or the fluid that moves through them. Okay, functions. The basic functions of the cardiovascular system. Firstly, transport. Okay, so transporting nutrients, oxygen, glucose, hormones, medications, and waste to and from the cell. So obviously nutrients go to the cells, waste transported from the cells out of the body, and the gases we're talking about when we start to talk about the respiratory system, which is interlinked, which is why we do them together. In a similar way from week one, where we talked about the musculoskeletal system being closely linked, the cardiovascular and respiratory systems are closely linked as well. The second one, protection. So the white blood cells and antibodies are transported around the body to fight any diseases or toxins. And we also have within the blood the ability to clot. So when those blood vessels get damaged or severed, the platelets protect from too much bleeding after injuries. So obviously that's that's why we heal. That's how we heal after damage to those blood vessels. Obviously there's rare conditions that you may have heard of where people don't clot properly or they have particularly thin blood. So those are the two major functions of our cardiovascular system. So the biggest one is transport, the second one, the protection. Third one, regulation. Okay, so things like body temperature is one, so the shifting or moving of the blood towards the surface of the skin or away from the surface of the skin will help us regulate the temperature of your body. The second one there is the fluid balance. So how hydrated we are, obviously how much fluid goes into and out of the cells from the blood is regulated to help our function. So as we get dehydrated, obviously your body will tend to hold on to or retain more fluid because it's really important for cellular function, like we talked about a little bit last week. So all right. What I want you to do is pause the video here. You can have a go at drawing this if you like, but what I want to do is for you to have a go at labeling as much of that as you can based on what you know now. So some of you will have some knowledge of the heart and the cardiovascular system already. Some of you may have no idea. So if you pause this and go, I know nothing, and then move on, that's great, because we're going to teach you what you need to know in the next little bit. But if you can, if you want to hand draw that, that's great. If you have a look on the Moodle page, there is a Word document that's got this picture in it. So you can download that to your device and potentially, label that, drag and drop in your, or create text boxes, put as many labels on that as you can. And might be a good idea also to use that diagram as you go through, as you learn about the different parts of the heart, to put the labels in there as you go. So as I said, whether you do that electronically, whether you prefer to print that out and handwrite those on there, whether you've used the template or whether you've hand drawn, it doesn't matter, okay? But it may be helpful to do going forward. All right, so these are all of the wonderful things by the time we finish the session that you are going to know all about. Okay, there is a lot of labels on there, and we're going to go through each part of the heart, kind of bit by bit, so that we learn those as we go through. So again, there's a lot to think about, a lot to remember. The great thing about these video lectures is you can go back over them as many times as you want, and there's some pretty cool resources to engage in to help you with your learning as well. All right, so parts of the heart muscle itself. It's strong, it's hollow, so it needs to be hollow so that it's got the ability to hold and therefore pump blood through the body. We're going to talk about the chambers. Okay, so the chambers of the heart, there is 4. 2 smaller chambers that are on the upper part that are called atria. So on the left atrium and right atrium. Now, just to note, when you look at a picture of a heart diagram, you'll see on this picture, the right atrium is on the left-hand side of the picture. So you are looking at it as if it was, in somebody that you're looking at. So if you're looking at directly at me at my heart, or I'm looking at yours, obviously your right is my left. So just remember, when you label diagrams of the heart on paper, the right atrium will be on the left side and the left atrium will be on the right side. Okay, so not just to confuse you, but it's just anatomically we label things as if we were looking at them, from there, and the left and the right are relative to what we're looking at rather than what's going on for us. So the 2 larger lower chambers are called ventricles, again labelled left and right, so you can see them clearly on those pictures. They're labelled, they're depicted in blue and red to depict whether they are pumping or receiving oxygenated or deoxygenated blood, which we'll talk about as we go through. And the other part structurally that you need to know about is the septum, which is the wall that separates the left and the right chambers of the heart. So as we go through, you'll understand why all of that stuff is important. So if you have a look at the diagram that you either printed or drew, if you haven't already labelled those parts of it, let's label those. Pause this and label that now. So right atrium on the left side of the diagram at the top, right ventricle out on the left side at the bottom, left atrium at the top on the right, and left ventricle at the bottom on the right. Okay, so from the chambers, we're going to move on to the valves. Okay, so there is a number of valves here that are important in stopping blood just going wherever it wants when the muscle squeezes. So if there was no valves and a whole lot of holes, when the heart squeezed, the blood would go out all of the holes at the same time. So the valves need to open and shut depending on what's going on. So they've got an important role here. So looking at this picture there, essentially we've got, so talking about the atria and the ventricles, so there is valves between the atria and the ventricles, so that when the atria are filling, so that's the top 2 chambers, when they're filling, it doesn't go into the ventricles until it's time to go into there. Okay, so we have got between the atria and the ventricles, we've got the tricuspid valve on the left and the mitral valve, also known as the bicuspid valve, on the right side of the diagram. Yeah, again, remembering in terms of labels, tricuspid is between the right atrium and right ventricle, and the mitral or the bicuspid is between the left atrium, left ventricle. Can be quite confusing. Once you're looking at in diagrammatic form, it can be quite useful. So what I want you to do now is, and there's also valves. So, sorry, before we move on, forgot the pulmonary and aortic valve. So you'll see where from the ventricles at the bottom, there's two big blood vessels, one blue and one red, that go up. That's where the blood goes out of the heart when it pumps with every beat. So the blue one, on the left-hand side of the diagram, the pulmonary valve, that goes pulmonary. Anything relating to the lungs is called pulmonary. So that is pumped from the heart to the lungs to be oxygenated. Okay, so we're going to learn a little bit more of that when we talk about the respiratory system. The pulmonary valve, it's important that it is closed so that enough pressure can build up before the valve's released, and obviously push the blood through the blood vessels. Okay, so allow the heart muscle itself to create the pressure for that blood to go all the way to the lungs. On the opposite side, you've got the aortic valve, which does the same thing on that side of the heart. So that ventricle sends oxygenated blood to the body. That side of the heart, you'll notice, is more, in most pictures or depictions, is more muscular. That's because it's got to send the blood further. Okay, so the right side of the heart going to the lungs doesn't have so far to go. The left side has got to send that blood all the way through the body, so through that large blood vessel called the aorta, all throughout the body, from the tip of our heads right down to our feet. Okay, so that's got to create some really good pressure for that to be able to happen. And you'll see there's a little bit of some implications in terms of the way veins and arteries in terms of their structure because of that. Okay, they're a little bit different because of how their jobs and how they behave. Okay, so if you go back to that drawing again, hopefully you've still got it sitting next to you. What I would say is go and now add the valves in. So tricuspid and the mitral or bicuspid, also known, you could label them as atrioventricular valves, between the atria and the ventricle, left and right side. So some of these valves have multiple names. Pulmonary valve, that's an easy one to remember because that's between the ventricle and the pulmonary artery that goes out to the lungs. And the aortic valve, that's between the ventricle and the aorta. The aorta, remember, is the artery that takes oxygenated blood out to all of the cells in the body. Okay, all the blood vessels in the body. Okay, the next part that we're going to talk about briefly is the blood vessels. Okay, so these are the important blood vessels that are linked to the heart that obviously transport the blood to where it needs to go. So there's two that we talked about when looking at the valves in the last slide. So the first one is the pulmonary artery that comes from the right ventricle and takes blood to the lungs. Okay, so that's really important. Goes from the right ventricle up there, splits into two separate arteries that each go to the left. One goes to the left right lung and one goes to the right lung, taking that deoxygenated blood to the lungs to be oxygenated and then transported back. Okay, so the blood will then come back through the pulmonary vein or veins, so you can see them coming back towards the heart into the atria, into the left atrium. Again, that's the filling chamber. It's going to go through that valve into the ventricle to be ready to be pumped through the aorta, which is the main artery that leaves the heart. Okay, so the pulmonary artery takes blood from the heart to the lungs. Pulmonary vein brings it from the lungs back to the heart. So our aorta takes it from that left ventricle out to every cell in the body. Okay, so really important that the valves are working nicely. You'll see that's the largest artery in the body. It'll have branches that go off into all the different parts of your body, so up towards the brain, down towards the torso and the feet. Thick muscular walls, and we'll talk about that when it comes to the difference between arteries and veins shortly too, to withstand the pressure of the heart pumping that blood out. Okay, and the last one we're going to link to there is the so coming into the right atrium. So once it's been to the body's used the oxygen or taken the oxygen out of the blood, and it comes back deoxygenated, comes back into the right atrium through either the superior vena cava, so superior just meaning it's coming from the top part of the body, or the inferior vena cava, which means it is coming from the bottom part of the body, from the abdomen or the feet. Superior vena cava is coming from anywhere pretty much above the heart. So all that filters back in, and it kind of comes through that, and it fits into that whole cycle. So what I've got for you next is a brief, it's a GIF or an animation that just shows you how the blood cycles through the heart visually. So I'm just going to shut up and let that speak for itself, and then I'll join you on the slides to follow after that. Okay, I changed my mind. I'm going to come and talk over this thing. So this is a visual depiction of Mr. Red Blood Cell there, taking his journey through the heart, that kind of helps visually explain what's going on there. So that the stuff that we'll talk about today kind of all comes together, and we understand the flow of blood through the heart, because it can be a little bit confusing. So he comes in the vena cava, superior, inferior, into the atrium, through the valve into the ventricle, through that valve and out the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Okay, get some oxygen, comes back into the atrium, through the valve into the ventricle, and then out the aorta to the body, goes and does his thing, and then he comes back empty again with no oxygen, comes back into the heart and goes through the whole cycle again. Okay, so this just visually depicts that. What I would encourage you to do is watch this over and over. You can have a look at this in the PowerPoint that is on Moodle. The animation should show just like it is here. If you want to have a look for this, if you Google Amoeba Sisters and cardiovascular system, so pathway of blood through the heart, you'll be able to find this thing and have a look at it there as well. But it should work just like it is here and running through on that continuous loop. When you watch both when you watch this, and if you have a look at the original PowerPoints that don't have the recordings on them as well, you should be able to watch this and seeing that and putting the names to the different parts they go through could be quite useful. I know for me, I'm quite a visual learner, so this is this stuff helps kind of pull it all together and get that reinforce that learning, because there's a lot to think about when it comes to this stuff. Okay, here's a static depiction of pretty much what we had to look at with that last little GIF that I showed you. So this here just shows a picture with everything labelled, all the arrows showing the same direction through the heart that we had to look at previously. And kind of physically, in terms of the visual, has the lungs there, so you can kind of understand how that works. Yeah, so use the moving visual plus this to really reinforce that stuff. If you want to draw the arrows in terms of how it goes through the heart on the picture that you've either printed or you've drawn out. If you want to draw this, I had a student have some really cool learning and success from drawing this on concrete with chalk and physically walking through it herself to help her remember and understand that stuff too. So get creative, use some of the online resources. Don't be afraid to get out of the house and do something a little bit more kind of practical relating to that as well to help you learn. Okay, the next slide is an interesting, another interesting gift that I found that I wanted to share with you guys. So let's have a wee look at that. Okay, basically, gross. Some people like the stuff, some people don't. Essentially, it shows how things would happen in real time, because the thing is that both atria and both ventricles contract at the same time. So obviously there's blood going to the lungs all the time and out to the body and coming back all the time too. So you can see there how the valves are working in terms of the timing. When the atria contract, the valves between the atria and the ventricles have to open to allow that to happen. Obviously they need to close so that when the ventricles contract, the blood doesn't go back up into the atria and get shot out either the pulmonary artery or the aorta. So let's leave it at that. If you want to watch this again, you'll be able to see that same GIF on the PowerPoint as well as on this particular video. So let's move on to looking at the blood vessels, so the next part of the system. Okay, so part number 2, blood vessels. We're going to talk about 2 different types, arteries and veins. You've probably heard them talked about before. The number one thing to remember is arteries always go away from the heart and veins always come back towards the heart. Okay, so it talks here about veins carrying deoxygenated blood and arteries carrying oxygenated blood, which is right most of the time. But when it comes to the pulmonary circulation, so that relates to the lungs, between the heart and the lungs, it's a little bit different, because the pulmonary artery that goes from the heart to the lungs carries deoxygenated blood, and the pulmonary vein that comes back towards the heart carries oxygenated blood, because obviously that's what happens at the lungs. So that's the exception. But if you remember, the arteries go away and veins come back towards the heart. That's the most important thing. Arteries will have strong, thick muscular walls so that they can cope with the pressure that the blood is being pumped out of the heart. Okay? If they were flimsy, then we would have issues with ruptures and blood getting into places where it shouldn't. Arteries are strong to be able to cope with that. Veins, thinner muscular walls, and they also have valves to prevent backflow. So veins, especially those that are coming up from your lower body back up towards the heart, have got to work against gravity. Sometimes that doesn't always work, so valves will help the flow of blood to continue in the right direction and stop it from going backwards down towards and pulling in the feet. As well as that, when you move, muscles actually help, and it's not listed on here, but muscles actually help pump that blood or that fluid back towards the heart as well. So when we're moving around, that's one of the reasons, obviously, that it's important that we continue and move around as much as we can, because it helps the circulation of that fluid further through the cardiovascular system. And again, so the arteries carry the oxygenated blood, so every cell or organ in the body needs that. Obviously, the veins have an important role as well at getting rid of all the waste out of those cells and getting those out of the body where we don't need them or don't want them. Okay, third different type of blood vessel is capillary. These are really cool blood vessels. This is where the magic happens. This is where the action is. So they are the link between the arteries and the veins. They are networks that have a massive surface area to allow that gas exchange to happen. So for that oxygen to go from the blood out into the tissues, and for the carbon dioxide to come from the tissues into the blood to be transported back to the heart, and then obviously at the expelled through the lungs as well. So capillaries are only one cell thick to allow that to happen. Okay, so it couldn't happen in an artery because it's too muscular. Again, veins, they wouldn't allow that to happen as well. So capillaries are specifically designed to have a big surface area to make it easy for that stuff to happen. So for oxygen, nutrients, carbon dioxide and waste to be transported across to one side or the other there. Which was the third part of our cardiovascular system. So we've been over the heart, we've talked briefly about the blood vessels. Now we're going to talk about the blood, so how that gets transported, or the medium that it gets transported. So 3 functions: transporting nutrients, transports waste products, so nutrients in, waste products out, pretty much. And yeah, specific examples there of waste products, so stuff that's been excreted or processed by the liver, or filtered out at the kidneys as well. So stuff that's been processed at our liver, for example, alcohol, stuff that's been filtered out at the kidneys, potentially urea, drugs, other substances that our body has decided that we don't need. The blood also regulates how much fluid, so we talked about right at the start of the lecture. It allows us to regulate that in our cells because we can take fluid from the blood, or the fluid aspect from the blood, or obviously take fluid from the cells back into the blood to regulate what's going on. And moving the blood to different parts of the body helps regulate temperature too. So like when you get hot, the blood comes towards the surface of the skin, so it helps that cooling by evaporation. When you get cooler, the blood gets moved towards the center of your body and away from the skin, so you don't get that same effect on the temperature. And the other thing is, there's many things that it helps regulate, but the other thing mentioned there is how acidic the blood is. As well, you might talk about different electrolytes or different kind of substances within the blood that are regulated as well. Okay, we talked also about helping protect us from infection. Contains clotting agents that help us stop us bleeding to death. And we talked about those white blood cells and the antigens and stuff that it transports to fight foreign invaders and infections and viruses and such things. Okay, the last slide on the bloods. So the colour of blood depends on the amount of oxygen in the blood. If it's lots of oxygen and lots of red blood cells, it'll be bright red. If it is low in oxygen, it will contain less red blood cells, or will have and will be a more blue-red colour. Okay, the average adult has about 4 to 6 litres of blood, depending on your size, and it's made up of 2 parts. So plasma, which is the liquid portion, pale yellow fluid, mostly water, but contains proteins, nutrients, gases, ions, waste, a whole lot of other things, and antibodies that we talked about. The formed elements, or the solid elements, so red blood cells, platelets, white blood cells, all of those things form part of it as well. All right, that is about all you need to know. So what I want you to do now is go back to that diagram of the heart. If you haven't kind of filled in all the bits that you can, then do that. Feel free to go over that, kind of print that or use that document as many times as you want. And by the same token, however many times you want to rewatch this lecture to help it sink in, by all means do that as well. So hopefully your picture now is looking a little bit like the one I showed you at the start with all of that stuff on there. And hopefully some of the stuff has started to introduce you to. So after watching this lecture, I don't expect you to be an expert, but it's exposed you to some of those things. So go back and rewatch it. Engage in some of the material. So there's some quizzes, a couple of Kahoots, and some videos to watch there on conditions that might be really useful in helping you understand that, the cardiovascular system and the basic kind of anatomy and physiology. So the structures we talked about and kind of how they work and how they operate and why they do what they do. Okay, this is much more to learn. Feel free to go and explore some more resources. Essentially, all you need to know is in here. Now we're going to move on. I'm going to pause that there. If you want to go and have a play with the cardiovascular system Kahoots, then that's cool. And maybe come back a little bit later and watch the conditions, so the two conditions that we have related to this. I'll put in as a separate lecture here. So ka kite. See you soon. And yeah, make sure, don't stress, there's a lot of information there, but just use the resources and go over them as many times as you need to. Okay, we'll talk soon. Ta-ta.